This brings us now to our final panel with the Competition and Market Authority. Emma Haley, thank you so much for joining us. Emma, perhaps I could start with you. We've just heard some of the least plausible evidence I think the committee has ever heard about the competitive dynamics of the ticketing market. We've seen real evidence today of price gouging by supermarkets in poor communities. And we've seen an extraordinary situation in the airline market where prices are surging to astronomical levels, fleecing fans who want to go to their favourite events. What on earth is the CMA doing to try and bring justice for consumers in this country?
Thank you. I just first wanted to say thank you very much for having us here today. We really do welcome the chance to come to committee and account to Parliament for the work that we do to protect your constituents, and we've listened to those sessions with very great interest. In terms of what you've asked, clear competitive prices are absolutely vital to consumers, and they are very, very important to the CMA. We have, over the past couple of years, undertaken an extensive programme of work looking very specifically at prices and work that we can do to protect consumers through our work in the groceries sector, through road fuel, through looking at IVF, looking at will writing. Our priorities for enforcement under the new DMCCA regime place protecting consumers squarely at the heart of that.
I appreciate you've got an incredibly tightly defined role within the law set out by this place. But just tell us what on earth you felt listening to the evidence that we've heard this afternoon. Did you feel that consumers in this country are adequately protected today? Not as a regulator, as a citizen.
There is clearly work to do. We are absolutely committed to doing that work, and we think that with the new enforcement regime under DMCCA, we have better tools now to do that work than before. What I would say, though, is that the CMA has worked hard over the last years. We have delivered £23 for every pound back to consumers. We've delivered... Sorry, can you not hear me?
I can't hear you.
Sorry.
Just need to come slightly closer to the mic. You've delivered how much?
£23 back to consumers for every pound spent. Sorry, that's not right. We've delivered 10 billion in benefits to the economy since the CMA was established, and 175 million of benefits directly out of our consumer protection work across areas of essential spend, across the sectors that we've talked about today in groceries, airlines, hotels, car booking. The CMA has taken action over the last years, including to protect consumers through the COVID pandemic.
Are you asking us to believe then that the enforcement regime that we have in this country on prices is okay?
I think the new regime really gives us the tools to take more direct and more effective action than we have in the past, and we're absolutely committed to doing that, and prices are absolutely key to that. We have specifically called out pricing in our approach document. We are looking squarely at pricing practices, drip pricing, misleading pricing practices. Those are among the most important priorities to our team as a consumer protection team at the CMA.
Okay, well, look, is it right then that Tesco's can charge my constituents who can only get to a particular store 10% more for a box of Weetabix than if they were lucky enough to be able to go to the superstore in Quinton? Is that right?
If I may come in on that point,
of course.
Chair.
Any light anyone can shed, very welcome.
We absolutely get that concern, and we all know that the importance of grocery pricing on household spend. So it's been a vital part of our work, and we've been looking rigorously at the supermarkets and the way in which they price, the healthiness of competition, because we know when there is effective competition, that bears down on prices. But you are absolutely right that there are consumers in parts of the country, whether that be in a particular rural area, or you mentioned some constituencies that may have a demographic of lower income, and I've heard in the previous witness earlier on was talking about inner cities as well, where prices may be higher. We looked at that and we did find that. I think
You did find what?
that convenience store prices were higher.
Okay. And is that legal? And today, is that legal?
So we looked at the health of competition in that market and whether anything about competition was driving the inflation of food prices. We didn't find that was the case. And at the CMA, we hear the concerns, but we have limited levers to pull. We can look at competition, we can really bear down and make sure competition works effectively. And Ms Cochrane and myself, we enforce consumer protection law, and we can make sure that consumers are treated fairly. But the CMA does not have the role to set prices. That remains a commercial freedom for businesses. So whilst we absolutely get that that's a very cold comfort for a constituent who pays more, but for us, if we do not find a competition problem or a problem with consumer protection law, we do not have the jurisdiction to intervene any further. But where we find those problems, we stretch every sinew of our powers to make sure that we are having a positive impact on consumers and prices in this country.
Okay, so just so we're totally clear, the law of the land today allows a company like Tesco's to charge poor people 10% more on their shopping basket than people in the middle class area down the road.
It does not allow them to trade anti-competitively, to exclude their rivals that might want to come in and charge lower prices. It does not allow them to collude, and it does not allow them to mislead or be dishonest with their consumers. And where we find that kind of egregious conduct, we act.
Okay, so we as a committee might conclude that there is a gap in the law. Charlie Maynard.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, afternoon. Whoever would most like to answer these ones. So the Digital Markets Competition Consumers Act, DMCC Act, received royal assent on May 24, 2024, and came into force on April 6th this year. I think until today, and I'm aware of the Google announcement, there haven't been any actions taken under that DMCC Act, and I just find it a bit odd, given you've had a year to, you knew this law was coming in. There's, I think, lots and lots of unfairnesses going on. Everybody was like, if only we had these new powers, we'd get right to it, and then nothing's happened. And I'm just like, it doesn't sit well.
So I appreciate that nothing has happened publicly. I can assure this committee that that's not the case behind the scenes. So when you talk about the law coming into force in January, the consumer elements of that law came into force in April, and our enforcement powers relate to conduct that has occurred since the 6th of April. So you're right, we were preparing for this. We were preparing for this for a long time, and as the law came into force, we were monitoring the conduct of quite a large number of businesses across different sectors and across different behaviours. And one of the things that we saw overnight on the 6th of April was that a number of businesses changed those practices. And I think that's one of the things that tells us how important this new law is, that simply the fact that it came into force caused businesses to change their commercial practices to bring themselves into compliance. Not all businesses have changed their conduct, of course, and of those that did, a number of them won't have gone far enough. But what we have been doing is evidence gathering at scale, monitoring. We've been sending information notices. We've been taking the preparatory steps that we need to take to identify conduct that we can enforce against, which is only that conduct since the 6th of April. And you can expect to see announcements of the cases that we'll be taking in the autumn.
Thank you. Two more questions. One is, with your colleagues back at the beginning of the year, we had a conversation about subscription-specific rules, and we had a discussion about the meaning of spring 2026 and whether spring meant April or whether it meant October. I would love some confirmation today whether that spring does indeed mean April, and that these subscription rules, which means that everybody's being ripped off by subscriptions that they can't get out of, are actually going to be put in force, and we're not going to go easy on a bunch of corporates ripping off consumers by dragging spring out to October.
We agree. We want to see those rules come into force. That's a matter for DBT at the moment. They have consulted on the secondary legislation that's going to be required under the DMCCA, and they're thinking about the guidance, which is also going to be required. Those provisions are not coming into force before the spring, but I don't have the information.
Okay, so we should go to DBT on that. Yes. Okay, we will. And third one, I'm impressed that you were listening on the previous ones, and thank you for doing that. On Ticketmaster, I mean, it just feels completely egregious what's going on. The data seems to be very, very strong, and although Phil and Andrew did a nice stonewalling job. What's it going to take for the CMA to get onto this, because they are completely wrapped around the consumer and the consumer's been completely knifed?
We hear from this committee and we hear from the people that we speak to as well that this is really, really important. People should be able to go and see their favourite bands, they should be able to go to events, and they should not be ripped off doing it. We have taken action here in the past. We've secured undertakings with StubHub, and we've secured a court action by Viagogo. As you know, we're also taking action in relation to Ticketmaster's selling of Oasis tickets. Essentially, there's three things that we, as the CMA, can do here. We can use our consumer powers, and that's what we've been focusing on to date. We can use our Competition Act powers, or we can use our markets tools. In terms of our Competition Act powers, we have proactively called for evidence of collusion or abuse of a dominant position, and at the moment, as of today, we don't have evidence that gets us over the threshold to open an investigation. If there's further evidence, we would, of course, look at that with interest, and we would consider whether the evidential threshold is reached. In terms of our markets work, that's something we are considering at the minute. We can choose to open a market study, which would give us a period of 12 months to look at the market, and at the end of it we would be able to make recommendations to government. Or we could choose to open a market investigation, which would be on a time frame of 18 to 24 months, and that would open up the possibility of making orders, including the possibility, for example, of breaking up the businesses.
Just in terms of that market study, given the stats, which again are in the public domain, it's nothing that isn't out there already, what's the consideration as to why you wouldn't be kicking off a market study or market investigation, whichever one has got the most teeth now?
So there's a number of things we think about when we think about opening a market study. First of all, there's an opportunity cost to them, so we can do a maximum of 3, occasionally 4 markets pieces of work a year. Over the past, we have prioritised things like groceries, infant formula, road fuel, things that directly impact consumers, as this does. In the strategic steer, we've also been told that we must consider what's happening in other jurisdictions. And in particular here, we are aware that there's ongoing litigation in the US where Live Nation is headquartered, which may have the effect, ultimately, of breaking up those businesses. That's one of the things that the plaintiffs there are asking for, and we've been directly told by the governments in the strategic steer that we need to take heed of what's going on elsewhere and to avoid duplication wherever that's possible. So that is one of the things. We're also taking into account in this market the fact that there's regulatory reform on the cards in relation to secondary ticket, the government's call for evidence on in live events, which means that this is a moving area. And so we take all of that into account, but to be clear, our minds are very much open to the possibility that we could take this on, but we do need to balance that against other things that may also be of real import to consumers and constituents throughout the country.
Final question, if I may, Chair.
Yes, please.
You employ 1,000 people, more than 1,000 people inside the CMA. We've covered 3 or 4 areas today which are, very problematic. The idea that we're only chewing through 3 to 4 a year, if I was a corporate up to tricks, I'd be pretty happy about that. And so is the CMA kind of applying itself to work out how we could do 20 a year rather than 3 or 4 a year, and gradating them? You don't have to go in all the way, but trying to cover. And frankly, just by showing up and doing it, you're going to start changing behaviour. So it seems 3 to 4 a year does not seem satisfactory, given we've got a big economy and there's a lot going on in it, which isn't great.
So in terms of the work that the CMA does, there's a an area of non-discretionary work. That's our mergers work, where we have to review the deals that come in. There's the work that we do on the Office of the Internal Market, the Subsidy Advice Unit. Then there is our consumer protection work, the markets work that we do, and the competition enforcement work we do, where we have a significant amount of discretion about the work that we take on. We do think about those in the round. So when I say 3 to 4 pieces of markets work, that is literally using the market study and the market investigation tool. It doesn't cover our consumer protection portfolio. It doesn't cover the Competition Act enforcement in relation to collusion or abuse of dominance. Those are different. And we do think about them across the piece. We think about ensuring that we have coverage of markets that directly impact consumer. That's been a big focus over the last years, particularly in relation to protections arising out of the pandemic and in relation to cost of living pressures. So that's our work, for example, in road fuels, infant formula, groceries, and so on. But we also need to think about the non-consumer facing markets. So, for example, we've just opened in the last week a market study in civil engineering, which is obviously very important in terms of the growth agenda. And we have to consider, again, the government strategic steer that tells us to focus on the 8 industrial sector strategies.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, just back to the Oasis incident and your investigation. I think you found a litany of failures, that they missold tickets as platinum when they were no different to the standard ones, hiked up the prices. Would you say that Ticketmaster, and from what you heard of their evidence just now, misled customers by using the fear of dynamic pricing, sort of putting the pressure on people, even if they didn't technically dynamically price on this occasion?
So going back to that investigation in particular, you're absolutely right that we have concerns about the conduct of Ticketmaster during that particular sale, and that did include the clarity around the prices and the ticket. So we have an ongoing investigation into that at the moment. I am limited in terms of what I can say there, and I can't comment right now whether or not Ticketmaster is misled with that particular statement that you called out. But we have also undertaken extensive work looking at dynamic pricing, and I think whether you call it dynamic pricing, fixed tier pricing, capped pricing, from the consumer's perspective, they want to know what they're going to get, and they want to be able to appraise whether that's something they can afford or it's a good deal for them. So regardless of whether you had a certain number of cheaper tickets and they sold out, or your prices are varying more in real time, we've called on those traders to make it much clearer to consumers about what's going to happen, so they know exactly what they're going to get. In the Ticketmaster investigation that you mentioned, we did have concerns that people were in the queue and they thought that perhaps the prices were changing in real time because of their behaviour, or but it was actually sort of as the last witness spoke about, sort of preset in advance, and we were concerned that wasn't clear, and that's one of the key bases for our investigation.
I mean, doesn't it at the end of the day just erode trust? I know I had a private members bill on this, and actually it was difficult to get Conservatives to sign up for your 14 names or whatever, because they said it's too much market interference of life. But as you said, it's a consumer protection measure for our constituents. They need transparency.
We think, absolutely agree with you, trust and confidence are the foundations, and you don't have to have strong consumer protection or competition. You need both to be working. If you want an economy to grow and thrive, you need to have consumers that are active and can be confident in where they spend their money and know that they're getting good deals. And that's why, as Ms Cochrane set out, it's at the core of our mission in the consumer protection team is to make sure that we do 2 things. On the one hand, we help businesses to get it right first time, so that consumers aren't harmed in the first place, because once harm has occurred, you've eroded consumer trust. So let's stop it happening in the first place, and then we will bear down where we see egregious conduct. That's exactly our approach and our mission under the new regime.
Do you think they're emboldened because they've got this monopolistic position? They're just sort of so big. They handled 900,000 ticket sales in the Oasis incident alone.
In relation to that investigation under consumer protection law, whether or not there's market power or the volume of seats is to be put to one side, because our focus is on those customers on that day in that queue. Were they or were they not misled? Were they given the right information about tickets? And as I said, we have concerns about that, and consumer law applies whether you are a small firm or some of the world's largest. It is blind to the size of the firm.
But their gigantic size, does that sort of help them be even more arrogant than they should be?
It meant in that investigation that a large number of consumers were affected, yes.
Just lastly, what are the lessons learned? What will improve for our constituents? And just the thing I was trying to angle at before, people are finding their accommodation, they buy it in advance and then it gets cancelled when these shows. It happens at Labour Party conference as well. You might buy it well in advance.
Biggest events.
And then they see, and so they cancel it. Booking.com, people like that. Would you have any power over doing anything to rein in those people? Because, then they hike it way up.
We have heard those stories, and it's immensely frustrating, particularly when you've booked in advance and then something can be suddenly cancelled. In those circumstances, if a trader has cancelled your booking simply because it's going to resell it at a higher price, they are at risk of a breach of contract, and there may be, if there are terms in the contract that put all of the power with them rather than the consumer, that could also be a consumer law concern. So in those situations, my advice to consumers is to talk to their local trading standards department or citizens advice, because those traders are at risk of breaching consumer law. And as Ms Cochrane said, the consequences now for breaching consumer law are so much greater than they were before because of the new powers under the DMCC. So for the first time, there is parity with the requirements of competition law and consumer law. And we've seen this already, but we continue to hope that every boardroom and every business in this country takes account of the fact that they are now at risk from enforcement from the CMA and the imposition of fines of up to 10% of worldwide turnover. In our experience and discussions, that somewhat focuses the mind.
Okay, Weston.
Thank you for that. You may have heard earlier I've done some analysis myself in the last 3 years looking at certain supermarkets and just how they price. And I'm interested, you said, hey, you've done grocery inquiry yourselves. In that inquiry, did you discover that they supermarkets price differently for similar category products, but they label them differently? Did you come across that?
That wasn't at the core of our investigation. We were primarily looking at whether the rise of what's now sort of common in our daily shop, but at the time was relatively new, for loyalty pricing, whether or not those discounts were genuine and fair. So we looked really quite forensically at those prices and some of the differences between sort of brand and non-brand products, but no, we didn't look at that precise question.
Okay. So you haven't looked at sort of transparency for the consumer or anything like that in that other part of what they do?
So we've been very clear with the supermarkets about the information that they provide to consumers about pricing. So whether that be the detail on the edge of the shelf, if it's about the discount, what was the price before, is the price that they're seeing absolutely genuine, so that exactly consumers can have trust and confidence in the prices that they see. That was the focus of our investigation.
On the tickets that we were talking about, you heard us referring to what the US Department of Justice is doing. Do you have concerns about the growing dominance of, say, a company like Ticketmaster? And do you fear that they could achieve a similar sort of market dominance that is currently enjoyed in the US market and in Ireland?
Generally speaking, what we want is thriving competition, and particularly in this sector, which really matters to people. there are limited levers that we can pull in terms of preventing organic increase of market power. So if they're increasing their market share because that's where people are shopping, it's quite difficult for us to do something about that. If they are in a position of dominance already, they're not able to abuse that dominant position. And abuse could, for example, be through charging excessive prices or price discrimination. If we were concerned that the way that they were growing market share was a function of something that was going wrong in the competitive process, then we could then look at using those markets tools that I was speaking about earlier. So there are different things that we could do, but it really depends on what's going on. But as I say, we are actively considering whether we should be looking at this market sector.
Okay, and you said earlier, I think, Emma, that you perhaps do 4 or 5 inquiries, studies. Is that sort of at any one time, or is it over a year? And just out of interest, what resource, how many people does the CMA employ?
So the CMA as a whole employs around 1,000, and then we have in the Consumer Protection and Markets Division in the region of 110 at the moment.
And then there's mergers, the rest of it?
Mergers, there's competition enforcement, there's our data unit that's looking at ensuring that we're using technology, new technologies, including AI, as effectively as we can, both in the way that we work, but also in the way that we do enforcement, so detection, and we're doing some really interesting work to detect more consumer infringements with that team at the moment, and also corporate services, as you would expect.
When you're doing an analysis, what are the criteria on which you base sort of reasonable grounds for doing an inquiry or investigation?
It depends which tool we're using. If we're in competition, generally speaking, we prioritise based on the impact that we can have, whether we can actually be effective, whether we can generate change in the market if we see a problem. We look at how important it is to consumers. We look at the government strategic steer, looking at the fact that there's those 8 industrial sectors that the government has asked us to focus on, and we look at whether it's an intervention that is pro-growth, pro-investment.
Okay, Sarah Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on some of what we've heard today, and particularly if we follow on the sort of supermarket theme. What we seem to be being told was that the Tesco and the Tesco Express, or the Sainsbury's and the Sainsbury's Local, were somehow completely separate businesses that operated entirely exclusively, but they're not. They're under one, they don't have a separate entity. So these are just operating segments. They've got nothing to do with actually a legal structure in that sense. And so really these are just all operating costs for the business, but that's the excuse given for why there are price differentials at different stores. And I just wondered whether or not that's the type of thing that you might be looking into for these reasons why they can't possibly do it. It's out of their control. Because, in a former life, when I had to deal with employers, the same claim would be used, which would be, there's a site and it makes no money at all. One very famous crisp factory once made this excuse, which was that the entire site that made all the crisps didn't make any money, so they couldn't possibly pay a pay rise. So again, it's the convenience of these segments that is used as the excuse as to why they can't take action. And I just wondered whether or not you come across these types of arguments and what you think you might be able to do in terms of challenging that.
So we do look particularly with the supermarkets. We look overall at how competition is working, and as I said earlier, we didn't find that a lack of competition was causing those price rises, and nor did we find that there were particularly higher exploitative margins at convenience stores. As I think, as you heard in the earlier session, there are different costs. But I completely understand the point that if you are at a convenience store paying more, and it's a large firm, that feels incredibly frustrating and unfair. And we have intervened where we found that the cause of any of those kinds of problems is within our sphere, so a competition problem or a consumer problem. So in terms of the ways that the supermarkets behave, they are ultimately accountable to their customers, and they're accountable to committees like this one. But us at the Competition and Markets Authority don't have the ability to say to somebody like Tesco's or Sainsbury's that they should open a store in a particular area, that they should lower the prices to their larger retail stores. Those aren't the powers that we have on the books to use. So that is the honest answer, but I realise that's not one that a constituent wants to hear when they're paying 10% more at their convenience store.
Thank you.
John Cooper.
Thank you, Chairman. Can I put it to you that the CMA is a bit of a paper tiger? You talk there about the powers that you've got, in theory, and these companies are at risk. How much risk are they actually at? Are you not swamped by all this? Could you first, Emma, perhaps?
We have, as with all public authorities, we have to prioritise the cases that we take, but we think with the DMCCA coming into force, with those higher sanctions, that creates credible deterrence where there hasn't been any until now on the consumer side, because we haven't had those powers to impose fines, to order companies to pay redress, to compensate consumers that they've harmed. And I think that makes a real impact. And when we've been out talking to businesses, there are real meaningful shifts in the way that these businesses are thinking about consumer compliance now that were not there last year because the risk profile was just simply not the same. I don't think we're a paper tiger. We have active lines of inquiry. We will be bringing those into live investigations at the right time. But I appreciate that right now you're not seeing the sort of progress, but we would be delighted to come back and talk to you next year about the cases that will be open at that point.
Jam tomorrow, but no jam today.
Picking the fruit.
Yeah. Hayley, is it a structural problem with the CMA? Is that the difficulty, that you're geared up really to do a great investigation into whether or not petrol prices across the country are being fiddled, for want of a better word, but when it comes to things like the internet and buying tickets and things like that, you're just not at the races?
I would refute that quite strongly, and I would look at our record. And particularly the point you made about how tough we have been as an authority. We've taken consumer protection law investigations against some of the world's largest firms. We've been there for consumers during COVID, getting hundreds of millions of pounds back for them. Just last year, we got £4 million back from voucher to consumers where we thought that they were treated unfairly by opting them into a pre-tick box, a service that consumers didn't always want. So we have a very strong record, and that record will continue to be strong, and our impact will be much greater than it ever has been because we have these new fining powers and under the DMCC. I think the CMA is very well set up to tackle those challenges. If you particularly look at the way that we've been thinking about AI in recent years, we were one of the first authorities in the world to think about the impact of AI on competition and consumer protection and get ahead of the curve and think about what conditions need to be in place for markets to work well. We have a world-leading data unit which has data engineers and scientists, and as Ms. Cochrane explained, we're deploying some of the latest technology to detect possible consumer law infringements at scale across the economy. That is advanced for other consumer protection authorities around the world. So that's exactly where the CMA is, and we have everything we need to do the right thing for consumers.
So I would just add, even with the previous powers, this year alone, we have secured undertakings from Google and Amazon in relation to their processes to detect fake reviews, which are relied upon by 9 out of 10 consumers when they're shopping online. And the changes that we have secured there through the undertakings will make a real meaningful difference to consumers who will be able to trust and rely on the reviews that they see, and that will help them to make better decisions when they're buying.
I'm conscious of time, but very quickly, one of the things about dynamic pricing is that we seem to lack even a definition of what dynamic pricing is, and we've heard even today lots of ideas about what dynamic pricing might be or might not be. Is that something that you would ask of Parliament? Would it be helpful if we were to lay down a definition in law? We are lawmakers rather than law takers. Would that help you in your fight against this sort of thing?
We've looked at dynamic pricing in quite a lot of detail, and you're absolutely right. It's almost impossible to find an agreed definition, but we sort of then think about it from the consumer perspective. What do they see? What do they expect? How are prices changing in real time for them? And we've applied consumer law. Now, consumer law is principles-based, so it is agnostic to the technology that is being used, the practice. Today it's dynamic pricing, tomorrow it might be something else, but the underpinning principles that we have to deploy are exactly the same ones, and it's about not misleading consumers and treating them fairly and making sure they have the right information at the right time. And we do want people to be able to get the benefits of new pricing practices and new products and services. But we put out some advice on Friday for businesses, making it clear to them that you need to take people along that journey with you. If you're trying something new, you need to tell them so they know what to expect, and you need to just be upfront and honest with them about the pricing practices that are being operated. As I say, with our new powers, we think we do have the tools to tackle what we see in the economy today, but of course we sort of stand ready to assist this committee or government more broadly if it wants to introduce new requirements or think about new legislation in future. But I don't want any business out there to be under the misapprehension that if there is something new that the CMA won't be there standing for consumers. We will be, and we do it in two ways, as I said earlier. We tell consumers, businesses, what we expect of them, and then we stand up for consumers, and that's our approach.
So if I can paraphrase this, you're talking a lot about deterrence. You're talking a lot about detection. Mm-hmm. You're able to deter, you hope, with new powers. You're hoping that you can pick up on the issues. But the one that's missing, I think, is enforcement. You talk about in a year's time things are going to be great, but there's difficulties right now, isn't there? I mean, people are buying these items in shops, people are going online and buying things, and again, to Dr. Huck's point, she's not here, but I'm a great believer in the free market, and if you want to pay £300 or £3,000 for an Oasis ticket, it wouldn't be my choice, but that is your choice. However, the point about going online and clicking 300 and finding it's costing you 3,000, that's a different issue altogether, isn't it? So it's that enforcement bit that seems to be missing. Why is that, do you think?
I think we are taking active enforcement proceedings at the minute. We're litigating against Emma mattresses. We are enforcing against Oasis. We have recently closed our investigations into Google and Amazon. We secured undertakings against Simba mattresses last year. We're also active in our market space, looking at those consumer-facing markets that really matter to each other, to everybody. And so there is lots going on. We're also building that pipeline of new cases under DMCCA where we've only had those powers for 3 months and where we have to observe breaching conduct and gather that evidence to the standard that we need to be able to take decisions that will be challenged by businesses. And they need to be robust and they need to stand up, and it's in everybody's interest that we do that properly and thoughtfully and carefully.
Okay. Clock is slightly against us. Thank you very much indeed for that. Just one final question that Antonia Bounce wanted to put. Just on the infant formula market, can you just tell us very quickly, where are you now in implementing the recommendations? Are costs coming down for new parents, and what's happened to the pilots that were promised for the retailers?
So we've made those recommendations, and I believe that we're waiting for a response from government, and we stand ready to support in any way that we can to support those recommendations, because we think they're vital for making sure that that's an effective market for people, as was said in the earlier session, at a very difficult time for some people. And I was pleased in that session to see that some businesses already were sort of adopting those processes voluntarily. But yes, we stand ready to help implement those recommendations following on from our market study.
Okay, but you're waiting for ministers to respond first?
and we stand ready to assist in any way we can.